Kalorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents The Fragile Middle Class, Americans in Debt by Teresa A. Sullivan, Elizabeth Warren, and J. Lawrence Westbrook. Read by Suzie Althens. Preface to the 2020 edition. The payment of debts is necessary for social order. The non-payment is quite equally necessary for social order. For centuries, humanity has oscillated, serenely unaware, between these two contradictory necessities. Simone Weil. In the 20 years since the publication of The Fragile Middle Class, the world of debt and credit has undergone some seismic shifts, and yet the risks to multitudes of Americans have scarcely diminished. Durable trends, but some surprises. Some trends that we have identified in the fragile middle class continued and even worsened. For example, we sounded an alarm concerning subprime lending, both for mortgages and for credit cards. The volume of subprime lending increased through the 2000s, very often aimed deceptively and disproportionately at communities of color. Eventually, those high-risk mortgages were marketed all across America, targeting both existing homeowners and new homebuyers with extraordinarily complex loan agreements. The resulting volume of unpayable debt triggered the financial collapse of 2008. A worldwide recession began that came to be symbolized by its largest single casualty, Lehman Brothers. Over the subsequent months, it became clear that the superstructure of trading in portfolios of debts was collapsing under its fundamental flaw. Debtors couldn't repay the loans. The shocks from the economic crash on Wall Street spread out in waves to engulf entire industries, most notably the American automobile industry. Unemployment rates rose, and another trend that we had marked, the increased job insecurity of the middle class, intensified as businesses issued a mountain of pink slips. The Great Recession gave further impetus to the national discussion about health insurance, the coverage of people with pre-existing conditions, and the plight of the unemployed who had years to go before reaching Medicare age. The Affordable Care Act, ACA, provided some relief for these people, and in the debates over the ACA, the issue of medical bankruptcies was frequently raised. Our findings concerning the devastating effects of unemployment and the rising costs of medical care were deeply relevant in these deliberations. We showed how insurance coverage was inadequate, or insurance was tied to jobs that often disappeared just when people needed their insurance the most. We also emphasized that illness or injury often produced loss of income, compounding rising medical debt with falling earnings. There were also developments we did not foresee, especially the accelerated deterioration of the standard employment relationship. Digital capabilities transformed entire industries, tearing down some while facilitating new ones. Smart homes, online retail, and the expansion of electronic information changed Americans' daily lives. Employees in the old industries were often retired early or laid off. Employees in the new industries often found themselves experiencing quite a different work arrangement. They were sometimes expected to supply their own workspace and equipment, cars, home offices, computers, while foregoing fringe benefits that were once standard. The rise of the gig economy, with employees transformed into independent contractors, meant a much wider swath of the economy experienced unpredictable work and income instability without health benefits, vacations, retirement plans, or even some assurance that a job on Monday would still be there on Friday. Amazon Flex, TaskRabbit, Spare Hire, and Uber are some of the names associated with the gig economy. The new generation, millennials, often found that even though unemployment rates were low, because everyone could meet the official definition of employment as working at least 1 hour a week, their income was unreliable and their benefits non-existent. We also did not foresee the huge spike in the price of prescription drugs. another factor aggravating the medical bankruptcy problems. Insulin, for example, is a common generic drug, but the price tripled between 2002 and 2013. While Medicare Part D, prescription drug coverage, has been helpful for some, it has not been sufficient. The number of older people in bankruptcy has risen disproportionately, and it seems likely that the unforeseen increases in health costs of all kinds play a major role. Even if the medical bills are paid, it might be at the expense of other debts that are subsequently discharged in bankruptcy. Student debt has increased rapidly since 2000 in ways that we did not foresee. The fragile middle class devoted relatively little attention to student debt, which was much smaller when we wrote the book. But today, student debt totals $1.4 trillion and demands attention. Because it is somewhere between difficult and impossible to discharge student debt under the bankruptcy code, the result is a mass of untreatable debt stuck in the middle of our financial system. This creates a serious problem for our economy, as well as for the millions of indebted students. There have been widespread increases in tuition and fees for colleges and universities. Public universities, such as those that the three of us attended, have felt the squeeze as states cut support, and the resulting tuition increases have fallen on families. But an even bigger shift has come about through the explosion of for-profit schools. Although their offerings are mostly online, their charges greatly exceed those of many brick-and-mortar schools, and promises of highly paying jobs that lured in many students have frequently proven false. Another trend has been a great increase in debt for graduate and professional programs, very likely because young job seekers believe an additional credential will make them more marketable. Finally, it is possible that divorce plays a smaller role today than it did in bankruptcies circa 2000. Divorce rates have declined for persons younger than 55, but marriage rates have also dropped. Families are taking many different forms, and many young people feel too saddled with debt to enter a committed relationship. Heavy debts form a sort of negative dowry for many young people, even those with good professional jobs, let alone those in the gig economy. The anti-consumer changes in the law in 2005. In the 1990s, Elizabeth Warren was appointed the reporter for a review commission mandated by Congress to recommend reforms to the bankruptcy laws. Sadly, the credit industry seized upon the delivery of the commission's balanced report in 1997 to lobby for an all-out, anti-consumer set of amendments. Elizabeth and others convinced Congress to correct the industry proposals in many important ways in the course of an 8-year fight. But the core provisions imposing a means test as a condition of debt discharge became law in 2005. J. Lawrence Westbrook published an article in 2017 summarizing the subsequent empirical research done by the Consumer Bankruptcy Project and others on the effects of the 2005 amendments. His article argued that the changes were highly beneficial to the credit industry, but not for the reasons industry lobbyists had sold to Congress. Instead, the industry benefit came from raising the cost of entering bankruptcy. The evidence shows that the 2005 changes produced substantial increases in the fees lawyers charge for bankruptcy cases by multiplying the required paperwork. Those increases priced many debtors out of bankruptcy, producing the irony of people too poor to go bankrupt. Analysis of the credit data by scholars and the government suggests that the bonanza for credit card issuers, payday lenders, and the rest was especially large because much of their profit came from payments by struggling debtors who piled up late fees and penalties while falling in and out of default. It seems clear that the reduction in bankruptcy filings by these struggling consumers produced far more profits for the industry than the considerable amounts they had spent on lobbying for the changes. The impact of the fragile middle class. Elizabeth Warren became the leading advocate for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, and in 2010 to 11, She served as assistant to President Barack Obama to set up the agency. Despite political controversy and repeated efforts to eliminate the Bureau, the CFPB has proven its worth by defending defrauded debtors against powerful corporations, encouraging more plain-language credit agreements, and generally balancing the power between average consumers and large creditor organizations represented by a phalanx of lawyers. In its first few years, the CFPB forced the big creditors to return more than $12 billion directly to people they had cheated. But the Trump administration has taken the agency in a far more consumer-unfriendly direction. Within the academic world, we are pleased to see, additional collaborators have come on board to analyze debt and debtor behavior. There have been several additional waves of the consumer bankruptcy study, with additional researchers joining us from the areas of law, sociology, economics, and health behavior. The study of debt and consumer behavior, once viewed as rather exotic by some of Teresa A. Sullivan's social science peers, is now a mainstream topic well represented in the professional conferences of several disciplines. International scholars have conducted studies of consumer bankruptcy in their own countries, and many of our findings have proven robust in other settings, testifying to the worldwide reach of companies such as Visa, MasterCard, and American Express. The adoption of modernized bankruptcy laws has pretty much followed the spread of the credit card system around the world. The publication of additional books and articles has proceeded apace, with great benefit to the students who are taught by these scholars. On the law school side, we are gratified that our work contributed to an explosion of interest in fact-based scholarship at many schools. Bankruptcy is among the legal fields that have most attracted empirical legal studies. On a personal note, by the time of the Great Recession, Teresa A. Sullivan was living in Michigan, where she was provost at the University of Michigan, prior to going on to serve as the 8th president of the University of Virginia. Elizabeth Warren joined the faculty of Harvard Law School, and after the adoption of the CFPB, she was elected to the United States Senate. J. Lawrence Westbrook's scholarship turned toward corporate and transnational bankruptcy as an American Law Institute reporter and as the leader of the U.S. delegation to the United Nations for development of a model law, now Chapter 15 of the Bankruptcy Code. After 20 years, we are still friends and have shared many of life's ups and downs, the death of parents, the marriages of sons and daughters, and the birth of grandchildren. Our struggles to understand one another's disciplinary lingos and conventions have made us better academics and have helped us in our work outside the academy. We hope that this reissue of The Fragile Middle Class will help a younger generation see the significance of credit and debt in the lives of Americans. Teresa A. Sullivan, Elizabeth Warren, J. Lawrence Westbrook, September 5, 2019. Preface. In 1989, we published As We Forgive Our Debtors, Bankruptcy and Consumer Credit in America, a study of people who filed for bankruptcy in 1981. In that book, we compared how the bankruptcy process was supposed to work with how it was actually working. That project, dubbed the Consumer Bankruptcy Project, provided a great deal of information, but it also posed questions we could not adequately answer. One of the most important of those questions was why so many families were in economic trouble. That question formed a cornerstone for the current project, Consumer Bankruptcy Project 2. Conducted in 1991, this second study collected the same information from some of the case files, but it added a questionnaire for all the debtors in our sample. With the questionnaires, we were able to collect demographic data as well as information about why the respondents filed for bankruptcy. These data permit us to compare the debtors with the general population, so we could learn about the economic fractures in American society by looking at the people in bankruptcy. Our prior book was about bankruptcy and the people in bankruptcy. This book is about the middle class as viewed through the lens of bankruptcy. Throughout the 1990s, bankruptcy filings soared, and so did the stock market. The juxtaposition of prolonged economic prosperity with high rates of personal economic failure is a paradox we seek to explain. We argue that the problems that have driven the petitioners into bankruptcy are, in fact, widespread and indicate the fault lines that underline the apparent economic stability of the American middle class. Many in the middle class are economically fragile, barely able to maintain their lifestyle. The bankrupt debtors represent those who have publicly announced their economic failure, but the fragility is wider and deeper than many observers of the middle class have acknowledged. Listeners of our earlier book may be disappointed to find that we do not use this volume to update our earlier findings about bankruptcy. We leave that task to articles we have written for the professional periodical literature. Our intention here is different, not to learn about bankruptcy, but to discover what bankrupt debtors can tell us about the rest of society. We are grateful to many people and institutions for their assistance in completing this book, although any opinions, conclusions, and recommendations do not necessarily reflect the views of any of those who provided funding or other support for our efforts. Our first debt is to the Education Endowment of the National Conference of Bankruptcy Judges, whose grant made possible the initial collection of data. We are also grateful for financial support and computing equipment made available by Dean Colin Driver of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Dean Robert Clark of Harvard University Law School, and former Dean Mark G. Udoff and current Dean M. Michael Charlotte of the University of Texas School of Law. Support from Harvard was made possible by the partners of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton, who honored their founder, Leo Gottlieb, with their generous contributions for research, and particularly by Jerome Hyman, whose advocacy on behalf of legal education has been extraordinary. We received funds to pay graduate assistants through the University Research Institute at the University of Texas at Austin and the Cox and Smith Incorporated Faculty Fellowship at the University of Texas School of Law. Because Judge Arthur Muller was himself so committed to legal scholarship in general and to empirical work in particular, we were especially pleased to receive important support from the Arthur Muller Chair for Research in Bankruptcy and Commercial Law at the University of Texas School of Law. We received summer undergraduate assistance through the Research Experience for Undergraduates project, which is funded by the National Science Foundation and administered through the Population Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin. The Rockefeller Foundation provided additional research support at its Bellagio Study Center. The magnitude of these contributions reminds us that empirical research is an expensive, lengthy, and arduous undertaking. For all these contributions, we are deeply grateful and mindful that without them, we would have no data to analyze. It was necessary to mobilize a large research team to complete this project, and we were fortunate to work with wonderful people. Catherine Nicholson supervised the data collection, and no research team was ever blessed with a more capable and dedicated person. Without her remarkably hard work and extraordinary talents, this project would not have been possible. For collection of a mountain of data, we especially want to thank Judy Tumbleson of Rock Island, Illinois, who gathered data from courthouses in Illinois for both our first and our second consumer bankruptcy studies. Linda Zimmerman gathered our comparison sample from the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. We recall her cheerful efficiency with great fondness. The Honorable Samuel Buford and the Honorable Keith London provided unswerving support for our empirical undertakings. The Office of the United States Trustee and the Administrative Office of the United States Courts both provided enormous assistance that we gratefully acknowledge. A host of people in the Texas bankruptcy courts helped us gather the data there. In Pennsylvania, the Honorable Thomas C. Gibbons and the Honorable Joseph Cossetti, along with Joseph Simmons, Carol Emmerich, Theodore S. Hopkins, Margaret Smith, Thomas E. Ross, Steve Goldring, Brian J. Williams, John J. Grauer, and Jean Veda were very helpful. In California, the Honorable Lisa Hill Fenning, the Honorable Christopher Klein, the Honorable Thomas E. Carlson, and the Honorable James W. Myers, along with Shauna Jarrow, Sandra Whitman, Lorraine Green, Larry Ramsey, Anthony G. Souza, Diana Gilbertson, and Charmaine Mills, worked hard under trying conditions to help us collect useful samples. In Indiana, E. Franklin Childress, and in Texas, the Honorable Larry Kelly and William T. Neary gave us important help in our collection efforts. In Illinois, the Honorable Larry L. Lesson and the Honorable John D. Schwartz, along with Thomas J. Mackin, Hardin W. Hawes, Ray Safonda, Ella J. Bright, and Randall W. Moon, assisted in our data collection efforts. In Tennessee, the Honorable George Payne II, Beth Broomfield, and Jed Weintraub offered their help cheerfully and efficiently. Any effort to do research on a tight budget requires the special efforts of generous friends, and in that category we must include Judge Buford's assistants, Gloria Faust, and Judge London's assistants, Lisa Perlin and Ann Davis, along with Stephen Reed at Stutman, Treister, and Glatt, and Kenneth Klee, who arranged for Stutman's support in copying cases. Without their help, this project would have died in its infancy. Roy Mursky of the University of Texas Law Library procured some very expensive documents for us, and his able librarian, David Gunn, located elusive reports. William Draper of the University of Pennsylvania Law Library also found reams of data for us. Our thanks go also to H. Spencer Nilsson at the Nilsson Report for lending us 1981 to 82 back issues and a full set of 1991 to 92 and 1992 to 93 reports. James Watkins and Elaine Beckett of Beckett and Watkins kept the credit card data coming in for years. An extraordinary group of scholars, led by Professor Jacob Ziegel of the University of Toronto Law Faculty, exposed us to important data from Canada and elsewhere around the world in connection with a conference on consumer bankruptcy held in Toronto in August 1998. Robert Mann provided a thoughtful review of the housing chapter, and Lynn Lopucky gave insightful and sometimes tart comments throughout. Matthew Pluger, before he became Dr. Pluger, was the outstanding research assistant who designed our database and performed the initial analyses. We are pleased that his doctoral dissertation applied our methods to another issue in federal civil litigation. Carter Hay provided much of the library research that helped make our analysis possible. Other research assistants who ably assisted us with library research, coding, and analysis include Mary Britton, Nicola Fuentes, Melissa Terhune, and Lisa Wyatt. Jennifer Frazier, now herself a published bankruptcy empirical researcher, helped us in the early stages of this project. Grant Malley contributed additional data analysis, and Ryan Bull and Dirk Seringa provided editorial assistance. David Johnson ably and creatively provided final help with statistics and substance. Elizabeth Guerrero spent countless hours on the final preparation of the manuscript, demonstrating unfailing good humor and supreme professionalism. At Yale University Press, we thank John Covell for his patience and enthusiasm for the project, and Laura Jones Dooley for her perceptive editing. The Honorable Barbara Sellers, a bankruptcy judge in the Southern District of Ohio, collected her own data about 1998 filings in her district and gave us permission to code and analyze the data. The Honorable Randall Newsom, a bankruptcy judge in the Northern District of California, collected data on Chapter 7 filers in 1997 and generously shared them with us. The Honorable Barry Russell, a bankruptcy judge in the Central District of California, gave us access to data he collected over the 10-year period 1975 to 85. The willingness of these judges to expand their workloads so that they could better understand the debtors in their district is inspirational, and their willingness to share their work product is exemplary. As these paragraphs indicate, we owe a great deal to many people, but our foremost debt is to the professionals of the U.S. bankruptcy courts, whose dedication in the face of mounting caseloads is inadequately appreciated. We are deeply grateful to all of the bankruptcy judges, their clerks, and the trustees who made our data collection possible in the 16 districts we used for the study. Their cooperation was essential, and they were cheerful and helpful in providing us access. We must mention in particular the U.S. trustees and their staffs, who distributed and collected the questionnaires that provided the heart of our data for this book. They cheerfully added to their already substantial burdens for no return except the improvement of knowledge. Without such public-spiritedness, our sort of research would not be possible. Our families have continued to tolerate our long-distance co-authorship and our passion for empirical research. In the decade of work on Consumer Bankruptcy Project 2, 2 of us lost our parents, and all of us saw children enter college. We experienced many of the stresses reported by our respondents, including buying and selling homes, changing jobs, and handling catastrophic medical expenses. Our problems, and the problems of many listeners of this book, differ from those of our respondents principally as a matter of degree, not of kind. Chapter 1. Americans in Financial Crisis. In the early years of the Republic's third century, America stands more economically and militarily dominant in the world than ever before. The middle class, backbone of the Republic, has experienced one of the longest runs of economic prosperity in its history. Yet in the bright blue sky, there is a line of clouds. We cannot know if it is just another summer squall or a terrible storm headed our way. Prognosticators examine the entrails in their economic models, while the rest of us cross our fingers. Stolid middle-class people, such as ourselves, would naturally check the house for holes in the roof and rotten floorboards. We have done just that, and in this book we report what we have found. To many molders of opinion, the notion that the middle class could be in crisis is remote, even unrealistic. Their part of the middle class is thriving, and they point proudly to the growing ranks of young high-tech millionaires, a sign of the great success of the great American economic engine. The proportion of Americans living below the poverty level has also declined, suggesting that the benefits of economic expansion have been widespread. To hint at economic vulnerability seems at best naive, perhaps unpatriotic. For other Americans, however, the 1990s were economically frustrating and confusing. The median real income recovered to its 1989 level only in 1996. For many families, income rose during the decade only because 2 or more earners went to work. The popular press focused on these dual-earning families who managed 30-minute suppers, juggled chores with aplomb, and sought quality time with their children. Less often noticed was that all of this work was barely keeping the family financially afloat. In fact, some of these miracle families only appear to be afloat. Lurking behind the suburban house, explicit in the divorce settlement and implicit in the pediatrician's office, is burgeoning consumer debt. The middle-class way of life can be maintained for quite a while with smoke and mirrors, and many credit cards. In this book, we examine hard data about the forces pressing on middle-class Americans. Our focus is primarily on economic effects, although social and moral factors are very much on the table as well. We do not try to resolve the debates, but we can cast some important light on them. With data drawn from federal bankruptcy courts throughout the United States, we can examine the crash victims of the American economy to better understand the financial risks all middle-class Americans face. These data permit us to quantify the stress that arises from 5 sources: the increased volatility of jobs and income, the explosion of consumer debt with sky-high interest rates, Divorce and changing parenting patterns that are increasing the number of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?